Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Scotonomics episode 94. Thank you very much for joining us. We are going out on Facebook, Twitter, and also on YouTube and TikTok now. So thank you very much for joining us, wherever you're joining us, if you're joining us live this evening. Hello, Karen van Sweden. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Before we get stuck into this wonderful session this evening, any thoughts on what's been happening the last few days or last week in economics in Scotland?
Yeah, well, I noticed that the NatWest Group, it was reported today in today's Press and Journal, has reported its highest yearly profit since before the 2008 financial crisis. So that's interesting in and of itself when we're in such straitened times.
Yeah, it's interesting to see who is doing well and which type of companies are doing well when clearly a lot of individuals and the population as a whole isn't doing well. Financial services, energy companies, and the like. So yeah, another high, but not a good high from the financial services sector there. Well, we've got our brilliant session this evening. This was actually taken almost a year ago now, but it's really still very current. It was taken at our economics, our Festival of Economics in Dundee. On the panel, we've got Amanda from Weal, Gary Gillespie, the Scottish Government Chief Executive, the Scottish Government's Chief Economist, and we've got Francis Reynar from the WeAll Alliance. So it's a really good panel. We look at well-being through a few different lenses, and there's a little bit of debate, discussion, disagreement on the panel. So I really hope you enjoy this and stick around for our kind of summary at the end. And please do drop in any comments or questions as we go through this session. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you in about half an hour's time.
Off with a little bit of talk about the circular economy, because we hear it all the time, but what does it really mean? And I think that it's important that we look at what our economy is like right now, where we basically take all the materials and resources, including people, that we've got to create and make something that we then sell, and somebody uses it, and when they've finished with it, they chuck it out. And it happens again and again and again, consuming more resources and more materials and making more waste. And a circular economy changes all that. So a circular economy is about reusing. The end result would be recycling, but we actually see that there would be a lot more things that you could do before you actually had to get to the recycle bit. And it's also about a lack of conspicuous consumption. And I've got a lot more to say about that, but I just wanted to give you that very quick. Let's stop the waste. Let's start recycling, reusing, rebuilding.
Okay,
Would you like to do the opposite of that?
Yes. Well, yeah, the well-being part. It's impossible to conceive of a well-being economy that wasn't also a circular economy. But yeah, a well-being economy at its heart is an economy that's designed to deliver good lives for all people and protect the health of our planet, which is fairly impossible to argue with. But there's more to it than that, and we've done some work to kind of define what that would look like in practice, and that's supported by vast swathes of civil society, and we're part of a global movement around the world that kind of share a basic definition of what that is. And really, it's about, instead of following the kind of outdated economic logic we've had for 50 years, that's gotten us to a certain point, but is not obviously leading to, we wouldn't be here if we thought the economy was doing what we needed it to. But instead, the economy would really put first meeting our fundamental needs, and there are 5 WeAll needs, or tests that we could use to say, okay, this is a well-being economy, and this kind of criteria would be the basis of all economic decision making. So firstly, making sure that everybody has what they need to live physically in safety and comfort, which should be the absolute basis of any economic model, surely, that we wouldn't have 1 in 4 children growing up in poverty in a well-being economy. And there would be a massive reduction in the inequalities in power and wealth. We would have access to a restored natural world. We would have the opportunity to participate in the economic decisions that affect us. So the economic decisions wouldn't just happen over here and people just accept them. We would use models like, for example, citizens' assemblies to, set the priorities for the country. And the fifth test is purpose. So that's having that kind of common good, collective well-being at the heart of our economic decision-making and our public institutions.
No, the circular bit's really important, and I think that comes through. I think on well-being, there's loads of different definitions of well-being economy, and people interpret in different things, from degrowth, mission economy, green investment, green growth. There's different bits. For me, simply, it's about kind of economic, social, and environmental well-being, including nature, and actually how you bring the three of those together into a kind of a system that improves and drives outcomes for people. So it's really about that, and I think we'll get onto this no doubt in different policy options and questions, but it's the intersection of those three, and actually economic decisions have environmental outcomes and social outcomes as well, and it's how you look and kind of cross-disciplinary how you deal with those challenges, which is central.
I would just say on top of that, though, remember when I started off about this extractive economy that we have right now? It's that extractive economy and the way that we've been building things and growing our GDP that's actually created the climate crisis. So you can't have a continuation of growth if you also want to halt the climate emergency. And we really need to stop some of the language that we've heard around this about achieving a well-being economy by growth. But I think that if I could ban a phrase, that's probably the phrase I would like to ban, because you hear it all the time, especially from politicians, which you'll be having to put up with them as well. They somehow think that you can grow an economy and then give people well-being. Do you want to come in?
Is it all right if I come in on that?
Absolutely
Thanks.
not.
It's not going to be funny at all. Right?
I'm
But it's important. Just to echo Amanda's point, I think, so in the wellbeing economy movement, people who've been coalescing around this idea, we are really keen to kind of, state our claim, I suppose, to the idea that how it was conceived was not that you can just do anything and go, well, that's going to be good for well-being, but that actually it's about an economy that doesn't prioritise growth. And certainly there will be countries, particularly in the global south, where growth is still completely inappropriate goal to adopt to make sure there's enough wealth for an adequate standard of living. But that, we recently put together a statement from 110 civil society leaders, including yourselves and children's charities, think tanks, really kind of specifying that a wellbeing economy shouldn't be about pursuing growth. We're kind of agnostic about growth. If the plans you came up with to say, okay, this is what we've really looked at it, and the only way to make sure that everyone has what they need is growth, then great. But we've been pursuing growth, and we've had economic growth in the past, and really still had huge levels of poverty. When we talk about the cost of living crisis, even the headline poverty stats are the same as they were, before COVID even. So this is really long-term problem that our economy hasn't been working for us with that growth-based model that isn't just about a sudden, the pandemic or the energy crisis. They've kind of exacerbated these things, I think. Sorry.
No, please don't apologise, Gary. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, so just to come in on the growth part, obviously there's been a lot of issues around advanced economies with rising inequality. We've seen the challenge with climate change. And if you take an organisation like the OECD, which primarily pre-financial crisis was very much about traditional economic goals, market efficiency, driving change. Now they're promoting a much more eclectic kind of well-being economy type approach. They have a centre there called WISE, which is well-being, inclusion, sustainability and equality, and much more driving that agenda. I think there's been quite a lot of discussion about growth and how growth fits. There was an interesting paper, I think, from Mariana Mazzucato and Andy Halliday about actually it's the direction and nature of growth that's important, not the rate. And actually the parts of your economy which through the transition will continue to grow. We're talking about maybe green investment, opportunities for change, so there'll be change within the economy. I think it gets back to the people's understanding as well of GDP and what it provides and what it doesn't and how it's interpreted as well. But no doubt we will continue to debate that.
We will. Sure we will.
So, thank you, each of you, for that. I mean, picking up on what you said, Amanda, this may be a case of trying to alter a narrative, and I think you've all put forward a very good argument for it in terms of focusing on a well-being economy rather than a growth-focused economy. So, yeah, and like you said, Francis, these are principles that are very difficult to argue with. So, what's holding us back?
Oh, listen, I could be brave.
Yeah.
Our politicians, our public life, a feeling that, oh yeah, it needs to be fixed, but it's not for me to do that. We have a passivity about us that would rather accept the status quo than create waves sometimes. And let's face it, if we continue to be passive, to accept what other people tell us is right, then young people are going to have a dreadful future in 30 years' time. And for me, this is about the economy, but it's even more about climate, because the two things are intrinsically linked. So if you want a planet that people can live on, and we live in a fantastic country that has every natural tool available to us to be able to do things right. But if you want it to continue like that, and not just being used as a greenwashing site for PPI trees, that's a dig at Nature Scotland, by the way, who have just...
That's a good pun, a dig at Nature Scotland.
Yeah. You know, we've got to be more determined in what we allow people to do on our behalf.
Okay, sorry.
You took a breath. That was enough of a... I don't want to harangue the audience, but I am really angry about it.
So, you talked about it's not maintaining the status quo. Maybe not. We live in a very individualistic society. Are we all too focused on what we can gain individually
You know what?
rather than thinking collectively about what might be 30 years
A
down the line?
well-being economy could actually give you more individuality, more opportunities to do things. People have a strange idea about what a well-being economy is. It's almost like, well, you're not allowed to buy anything, and therefore you won't have any fun. But actually, what about if you've got a community tool library, and they've got some really fantastic equipment that you would never be able to afford, or you'd never risk the money on buying it for yourself, but you can go down and you can borrow it to use it to make something. Or maybe the money that you save by not having to buy that tool in the first place lets you go out for a lovely meal at a local restaurant. A well-being economy doesn't have to be a boring economy, or it doesn't have to reduce your opportunities as an individual. It's an economy where we share to give each one of us a better life.
I think that's probably a couple of sentences worth remembering. It's a well-being economy is not a sacrifice of fun or your ability to enjoy life. Francis, did you want to comment on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I feel more hopeful in answering that question, in that I think the reason it's not changed is because we've really never had a sort of tested alternative. You know, with the growth aspect, there's lots of things that should have changed ages ago that haven't changed, but on this, there hasn't really been a concerted movement that's looking at doing economics that is separate from growth. So I think we're really just getting started on that. And actually, you know, when you give people the chance to talk about it, you know, polling suggests people are really in favour of wellbeing economy when you explain it to them. And actually, you know, if you look at surveys of like the issues that matter most to people, climate change and inequality are really high. Even in some of the richer like deciles. It's only like the richest decile where people don't think that the economy is kind of rigged in favour of the rich. So I actually think it's just that we're just getting started with a kind of movement saying, look, things could be different. And one of the things that makes it more challenging is that there's nowhere that we can point to and say, look, they have a well-being economy, let's just do that. But there are, where I have hope is that actually we are increasingly, because there are these like well-being economy governments, of which Scotland is a part, who have a kind of commitment in principle to sort of work together behind the scenes and test new policies. So from that group, there are emerging sets of policies that show how things could be different, and they're very common sense. So for example, in New Zealand, they have well-being budgets where the government comes up with their kind of well-being goals. And when you say well-being goals, it's really just saying, what do we want for our country? What do we need to make sure everyone has what they need and good lives? And then to get money in your ministry, you have to show how you would meet one of those goals. And there's loads more work and analysis and rounds that go into it. But essentially, everything you're doing, you can't justify something in terms of like, we need growth, we need productivity, we need investment. We need to show how it's going to, you know, reduce child poverty, or do something about climate change, or reduce inequality, or so that's a really positive example, and it's very straightforward. I mean, that's the thing, when you talk about it, no one would really, it's hard to disagree with. I think there are things like vested interests, of course, like rentier capitalism, but I really think actually it's a good story that people will buy into, and we're just getting started. And I think we need to like mobilise. And we're really just starting that. I mean, when we did this, we've only existed as an organisation with staff for a very short time. But when we put together this kind of joint statement, we were really overwhelmed with the degree to which, like, even fairly small C conservative institutions, I would say, were very keen to get behind this, because people realise we need a change at the sort of architectural level, not just, there's obviously lots of policies we could implement, but that if we had different architecture, we might have those policies as well.
And maybe I'll give a kind of Scottish Government perspective as well. So we've had the National Performance Framework, which came in 2007. It's now in statute. It's often described as Scotland's wellbeing framework. It has wellbeing as central purpose. Also describes the type of society that we want to be as well. The Wellbeing Economy Governance was instigated in 2018 with Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand. And now includes Finland and Wales, with Canada participating as well. And it's really about sharing. None of the countries would describe themselves as wellbeing economies. It's really describing how you get there, the transition, sharing the types of policies that are happening. We run what's called policy labs, and that's been one of the maybe positives of COVID. We have much more engagement through we can do these calls early morning and late at night that connect New Zealand to Scotland and Finland, and essentially we share what's going on within governments around subjects like wellbeing budgeting, child poverty, fair work, the role of business within a wellbeing economy, the role of investment, Indigenous populations, gender. And I think the example of the wellbeing budget is a good example, because most budgets are set on portfolio basis, so health, education, transport, and the wellbeing budget sets cross-cutting wellbeing agendas. I was saying, for me it's interdisciplinary. So in the Scottish budget context, it was about child poverty, transition to net zero. And the New Zealand example, departments actually have to bid in and demonstrate how it's joined up and how it's limiting that. So it's the start of a journey on this. I think the economic well-being for me, so that's our lens into it, that's why I'm involved in it, is the kind of role of the economy in enhancing well-being. Most people rely on income from work, so what happens in your workplace is really important. Fair work, how you're paid, how you're treated, the opportunities to participate in the economy. So the economic lens is really important in a well-being economy as well, along with obviously addressing social inequalities. Obviously we have got the constraints of nature, climate, the commitments to reduce targets. So there's there's something around all of that, but the economic lens is really important, and for me it's about having sustainable businesses is really important within an economy as well. So it's exciting. It's exciting. It's a transition, and it's about improving outcomes, as you said, for people at the centre of the economy.
Francis, you mentioned that we've got a lot of history of fighting against a different way of measuring our economy, and this is a pioneering, trailblazing kind of way of doing it. So, how do we know that a well-being economy is a success? How do we know? How do we look back and say, we did this, we got X result, therefore it's a success? Obviously, growth is a great way you can measure growth against different countries, against different periods of time. But like you had mentioned, Gary, there are other countries there that wouldn't describe themselves as having well-being economies. So how do we quantify this? How do we gather that data and say, yes, this is working, no, we need to change that?
One of the best metrics that I've heard is actually from Catherine Trebek, who said she would manage the well-being of a community by metrics such as what percentage of girls ride their bicycles to school. Because there's a lot of data in that one question about safety, about equality of girls and boys, about physical activity. And so this is not what you would get on if you were measuring GDP, you wouldn't be looking at those qualities at all. But once you start drilling down into what does well-being mean at a community level, and it might be different for you than for you, it's about finding out what makes people feel like it's working for them. And so that question of Catherine's is one that's always stuck in my mind, because it actually measures things in a very different way from economic. She didn't ask how much their bikes cost.
Yeah, or how much they pay at said school to attend. It's a really sensible question that is easy to measure, but it actually tells us an awful lot about what's going on in the background. And so for me, these kind of metrics are what we need to be developing over the next while. So when we look at communities, and we actually have to also think about well-being. A well-being economy is one that would produce jobs, but sustainable jobs. And so if you look at some of the things that we need here in Scotland, for example, warm, well-insulated houses that are built to passive housing standards. Well, how are we all going to get one of those? So that might be that a well-being economy would introduce a national house building company, because within that national house building company you would need a lot of skills, and you would also need to be able to train a lot of people in those skills. So you actually build something that is self-sustaining, because people are going to pay for the houses. You need to have the capital up front, fair enough. But you're actually growing a workforce who can then do something of benefit to us as a society. And then they will pay taxes, which will go back in, which will then help to develop it even more. So the next bit might be to put district heating systems in every town, and that would be the next bit that you would pay for. But these things need to be done. And sometimes I think when I'm talking about the well-being economy, it all sounds a bit esoteric, because very few of us actually think about economics in terms of our daily lives. And I apologise to all of you who, unlike me, probably have degrees in economics. But really, when we're talking about economics, we should be talking about how they affect citizens, how they affect those of us who are having to live with the results of what the economists tell our governments to do. And I've probably said enough now, and that was not a dig at any of my government.
No, not at all. So I mean, I think the well-being economy definition, I think some people think, oh, it's well-being. It's and there's a whole well-being and personal well-being.
Yeah.
How were you feeling yesterday?
I can't imagine it would be particularly popular if you went around knocking every door and asking them, are you happy?
Actually,
Be happy or not being interrupted.
Actually, the happiness thing is a big part of the well-being. There's a whole happiness country coalition group that look at happiness. The Office of National Statistics ask questions on well-being that are actually targeted at your own personal well-being, how you're feeling, your mental health, or whatever. So that's very much individual and personal. But when you're talking about well-being economy, you're talking about kind of collective well-being and the wider issue. So there's still something about well-being and how it's perceived in that regard. The example Catherine does with the girl riding at school is a great kind of analogy of a different type of indicator. The Scottish Government produced a wellbeing economy monitor last year. It covers a range of economic, social and environmental measures, and it's again trying to track progress. If you were to look back in 10 years' time, the National Strategy for Economic Transformation is really about how you get through to 2030 in terms of your climate targets, your child poverty targets, and improving people's outcomes. So there's a lot of change. There's a lot of change going to happen. A lot of change needs to happen, and it's the distributional impact of that change you're really talking about.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. But I guess just to say there are lots of different ways that people are already measuring economies differently, and obviously GDP is appealing because it's one figure, but we just know it's really only telling us how much goods and services being produced. It's not saying anything about, like, if we had an oil spill, cleaning that up would be good for GDP, but doing unpaid care for your child has no bearing on GDP. So just the fact that it's simple to measure is not a good reason to make that the thing the yardstick we use. And I think for me it comes down to using a kind of dashboard of indicators. So if I said to you, like, how are you doing, you wouldn't be like, I just had a fantastic, or like, how are you doing in life generally? You wouldn't be like, I just had a fantastic dinner. You wouldn't say, I've got £10,000 in my bank account, or I just got dumped.
I wouldn't. No.
If you just got dumped, that would like throw all of that out of the water.
Thanks, Francis. I feel great now.
But like you
so
can't.
A dashboard answer.
Yeah, dashboard. Yeah, exactly. You need to look at the full picture of what's going on to actually get a sense. So there's no one. I mean, there are some models people do advocate for an alternative metric, but I think for us, we like the idea of a plethora of measures. And the key thing is that these measures should be co-created with citizens, because we should be able to kind of say, well, okay, these are some of the trade-offs we might have to make. What's most important to us? What do we want to value? And that should be the basis of how we judge whether the economy is delivering.
Well, like the three of you have expressed, it seems really difficult to argue against. It seems like a much better idea, like you'd said, just because the numbers are going up and there's more money in the till at the end of the day doesn't necessarily mean that people's lives are better off. I hope I've understood.
But that's because you're not a wealthy corporation.
Not yet. Thank you. Maybe one day.
Right, hypothetical scenario. Scotland become independent and the First Minister comes to you directly and asks for 3 core well-being, circular well-being economy policies, just 3. You only pick 3. What 3 would you pick? And for Gary, I know you're a civil servant, so obviously you can ask that. So what I ask you is, can you give us 3 really solid examples of kind of well-being kind of policies the Scottish Government has pursued, or what you would say are the most pursued or most successful right now in the Scottish Government?
That's a brilliant question. Can I possibly add a small caveat to the end of that? You've asked for 3 core policies. Can we also assume that in this scenario you have unlimited resources to do whatever you want with it? Fair enough. I just do his question.
That's the problem with government policy, is that when you're talking to the electorate, you assume you have an unlimited, unemptiable wallet, and we don't. And so all of this has to now be seen under constraints. So it's not necessarily always what's the best thing we can do, but I think it's sometimes what's the best thing we can do that causes no harm. So I think that probably would be one of my policies. In the previous session, we had a visitor from Wales on the video with us, and we were talking about the Welsh Commissioner, who actually looks at every government policy to see the impact upon young people. So that would be a policy that would fit well for me into a well-being type of agenda, to have not just one person, but that every policy has to be assessed, both for harm and for benefit. I think that would be my first. The other one, which is so much easier to do, and I'm devastated that Scottish Government has just reduced the budget, is what I'd mentioned earlier, which is about tool libraries. Because tool libraries could be transformational to the lives of the very people that we're trying to make better. Just to give them access to something as simple as a tool library, give the way that you can borrow a tool, the way you can borrow a book, take it back when you've finished. It actually would make so much difference to so many people, and out of that would come all kinds of other things. People have hobbies that they then can create into their own businesses, or you get the gist. And the third one that I would say is universal basic income, because let's remove poverty entirely. Let's introduce a universal basic income. We know where it has been piloted. There have been fantastic, at least good results. And let's take us away from all of this having to means test people falling into poverty even when benefits are available, because either they don't know about it or they don't feel like they want to ask for it. They don't feel like they deserve it. So let's do that and allow people. Also, part of what I think is really missing in Scotland is this idea of allowing people to be creative if that's what they want to do. You're
trying to win me over, aren't you?
But, we push people down very firm career paths that at the moment are tied into GDP. So this is an opportunity to actually change that and to start thinking about the kind of country that we could be if creativity was put on a pedestal along with shareholdering. I think there's time for some real change. Wait for too long, sorry.
No, absolutely not. Francis, can we have your comparable answer, and then Gary will come to you in the middle for sort of a meeting in the middle.
This is a really fun task, thank you. And actually, the three I'm going to say are all ones actually I think the Scottish Government could do now, but in different scenarios there would be wider, impact of those. But firstly, just doing stuff to change the architecture of economic decision making, because then you'd get all the long list of policies that I would say if you'd asked for 20 down the line, and it would be harder to kind of backtrack on. So I think Future Generations Commissioner, but I'm not going to count that because Amanda already said that one, but I guess it comes under this basket of changing economic decision making architecture. And I think strengthening the national performance framework we have, which is already a kind of sets out some of our kind of goals as a country that are more than just economic growth, but also like instigating like a sort of citizens' assembly kind of process, so that becomes much more of a sort of democratic thing, and then strengthening that. So if I can have that as one policy, because that's kind of a reform and strengthening of the national performance framework. Then I think also a kind of citizens' assembly on tax, with a view to massive progressive reform of the tax system, which would do some redistribution and raise vital revenue. And so with the third thing, using some of that money for a minimum income guarantee, so that nobody's income could fall below what's needed to live. So it's does a similar thing to UBI, but you wouldn't automatically get it. It would be that you would never need to fall into poverty, basically. And I think with that we would see huge benefit. I mean, I can't think of, like, if there was one goal for the economy, everyone having what they need to live a decent standard of living should be, for me, the kind of foundational thing. So in itself, like, should be one of the first things we're doing, I think. But also, it frees you up. People spend, consume more when we're more stressed. Although obviously it's richer people in our society that consume more. But I think it would have all kinds of like health and social benefits if people were freed from the absolute crushing stress of poverty, and also the risk of falling into poverty, and that kind of sense of fear for your children, and they don't make the right career choices, they'll be in poverty. So they're my three. I really want to do this now. Thank you. How do I make this happen?
So me now, so there's loads of policies the government do at the minute that contribute to well-being economy. If I was to pick out three, child poverty is obviously a big issue. I would say the child payment, the £25 per week per child, which is part of the devolved social security, has been introduced in Scotland. I think that's really important. Child poverty is massive. I think the just transition is another one that's really important in that regard as well, about how we make the transition that's going to be required. Circular economy in sectors and industries and how we do that, I think that's really important. Linked to that is, for me personally, is the fair work agenda as well, and how people are treated in the workplace. And since Neil's in the audience, I'm going to give a shout out to community wealth building as well, an example of our policy and programme. There's legislation, a sustainable development bill that's coming to the Scottish Parliament as well, and the things around Wales and the Future Generations Commissioners and will be in, I'm sure will be considered as part of that as well.
My husband's Swiss, so so in Switzerland all the power is at the bottom, and the bits that local communities don't want to do, they push up. Right? So they might say, yeah, we want our local policemen, but fire service, no, it's you guys up there can deal with that. And so it's quite easy for me to see it in a totally different way around. But we have got a very moribund system of local government. I mean, some of us will still remember the last restructuring when Strathclyde was broken up. And what I'm finding is when I talk to people in my part of the world, which is South Lanarkshire, they look back on the old district councils under the big regional administration of Strathclyde. They really miss them. Because even though we had all this restructuring and it was meant to be more efficient and what have you, there's no feeling that the local authority, the regional authority, is acting on your behalf. Where I live, you can't get a bus to where my council sits. So if you don't have a car, you can never go and listen to a council session.
And I know how much we all do.
I do. I find it quite soporific.
Lovely, thank you, Amanda.
I think there's a greater emphasis on place again, regions as well. I think we're seeing local authorities. We've got regional groupings, Glasgow City Group, Lothians and Borders, local authorities coming together for that strategic planning and stuff. So I think that gap has kind of been filled in a little bit. I know it's not on a fully structural basis, but definitely planning on the economy is much more regional. The south of Scotland, we've got South of Scotland Enterprise now. There's still Highlands and Islands Enterprise. So that there is that greater... On the wellbeing economy, we did a pilot with Clackmannanshire Council, wellbeing economy pilot, and that was very much about bottom up. That's about what it means for you and your own community. And I think most of these initiatives, actually people know their own community, know what they need in their own community, so it makes it doesn't work top down, it works bottom up.
I will say though that I'm a bit cynical. If you look at participatory budgeting and pilots like that we've seen run across Scotland, you know, how much is it? 1 or 2% of the budget, the council budget, that actually gets decided at community level. And I know that there are, you know, bigger budget items that have to be delivered anyway, but there is a certain cynicism in letting communities have their say on certain things without actually giving them any power and control. And so a lot of the communities that I know have got consultation burnout. They're like, just don't do any more to us because we've been through it and through it. We tell you what we want and it doesn't change anything anyway. All it is a box has been checked to say a consultation process has been undergone. And I think that's a difficult problem for government now.
I mean, it's interesting though, even on the example about the New Zealand wellbeing budget, it shifted 2% of their budget. It was like 98% was the normal distribution, 2% was kept for their 5 strategic objectives where departments bid in. So, so yes, you're kind of like the 1%. It's really getting into the block, and they've got to start somewhere.
I hope you all enjoyed that. It was really nice. I really enjoyed watching it last week when we were deciding to make that one of our episodes for this year. And as I said in the chat, the story that Amanda tells about Catherine Trebek and her idea as a metric for a wellbeing society to use how many young girls cycle to school every day, I thought was absolutely incredible and really transformational when you look at the difference between that metric and GDP. And that's the topic I've covered in our article for the National tomorrow. So I hope you're able to find that. It really builds on to, I think, the conversation that they were having. Kieran, looking at that again, what did you think of that? What were the highlights for you?
Yeah, so there's a few things. With Amanda, it was quite an interesting thing that she said, and I've actually said this on Radio Scotland as well, you know, the idea that a no consumption economy is a no fun economy. And that example of using, say, a tool library, you know, that, for example, would mean if you're not spending money on a tool that you're maybe going to use once or twice in your lifetime, that you've got more money to go out and have a nice meal. You know, this is a really sensible well-being economy idea, a tool library. The other thing that Frances from Weal brought up about her 5 points was that participation and democracy. I think, you know, that's really, really important. I don't know if people's assemblies are necessary for everything, because obviously, you know, participation and democracy costs money as well. And as you know, in Scotland, we're currency constrained, obviously. But the amount of representation that we have in comparison to our European neighbours, there is much less advocacy for people here in Scotland than there is over there. So we definitely need more advocacy for people. The other thing I would bring up as well is that, you know, something that I don't think that perhaps they know about, because if you don't read council reports and you don't find them interesting, you won't know this. But in our council reports, we always have a function of environmental implications. That's always at the end of our reports. You know, how will this affect this? What do we need to think about? What's our risk appetite for this? So there's a lot of analysis of every report. A lot of boxes are ticked. How will this affect the environment? So these things are in place to a certain extent. I think Gary Gillespie also points out a lot of the things that the Scottish Government are busy with as far as the wellbeing economy is concerned as well, looking at happiness and those kind of things. So I think it's really important. I think the Scottish Government are on their way in lots of ways. We all know they could do a lot better if we were the currency issuer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you juxtapose that to what's happening in Westminster, you'll see a huge difference. And there's no wellbeing monitor, for example, in Westminster there is in Scotland. It was launched in 2022, so there's been 2 full reports on that. I think Gary mentioned, I think it was 15 metrics, and they include a lot of the kind of getting towards the types of things we would really need to focus on if we did want to genuinely create a well-being economy. And my final thing on that is, I mentioned in the article tomorrow around GDP just not being an inappropriate measure, but actually it's an inappropriate target to be growing GDP because of the impact it has on the environment. So really good to look back on that again. I hope you all enjoyed it. We're actually going to have a bit of a break next week. Because as you probably, or you might not be aware, March is exceptionally busy for us with our Festival of Economics. So we want to try and have shows right through March, but we need a little bit of a break to try and catch up on everything. So hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time, and it'd be great if we see some of you at our festival in Dundee and also our events in Edinburgh on Thursday the 21st. A lot more details on that as we hit March. But thanks so much for joining us this evening. And from me, we'll see you soon.
Good night.